how does this conflict align with biblical end times prophecy? Well, when you see a war like the war between the United States of America and Israel with Iran, just know that when you see a war in the seen realm, it is likely the result of a war in the unseen realm. That wars in the spirit world manifest themselves in the physical world. So we read in Revelation 12, 7 through 9 of the first war, and it says that war erupted in heaven. That one of the angels, who was called to be a worshiper of God, decided that he didn't want to be humble. He wanted to be proud. He didn't want to fall before Jesus' throne. He wanted to sit on Jesus' throne. And we know him as Lucifer, Satan, the great dragon. If my memory is correct, there's only 3 angels named in the Bible, Gabriel, Michael, and Satan. This might indicate that these are the 3 highest ranking. And think of angelic forces. When you hear, say for example, in the Bible, the language of the heavenly host, that's a military term for angels who fight at God's disposal. And so the 3 named angels, Michael, Gabriel, and Satan, may be the highest ranking. That would explain why when Satan decided that he would start the first war and he would have the first coup attempt and he would try to remove and replace God in the seat of all sovereign authority in the divine council, that ultimately when he fell, Jesus says 1/3 of the heavenly host fell with him. And so now Satan lost that battle, and 1/3 of the angelic host became the demonic forces. And so as you're looking at it now, you've got to just sort of put the backdrop over wars of spiritual wars. Where is God involved? Where is Satan involved? What is good and evil and right and wrong? And a tip for this is when Muslim jihadists, which is Iran, and again, their proxies, the Houthis, Hezbollah, and Hamas, as well as other bad actors that they fund for jihadist intentions, they will say, Allah Akbar, Allah Akbar. That's what they will shout when they're undergoing jihad and attack. And some would say that the proper translation is our God is great. Another possible translation is our God is greater. Either way, this is spiritual warfare. You're attacking people saying our God is great or our God is greater than your God. Death to Israel and death to America would be literally our God is greater than the God of the Old Testament and the God of the New Testament. That's what they're saying. And the fight is over ultimately the nation of Israel. And who has a right to the land? Well, ultimately, all of the earth belongs to the Lord because he is the creator of the heavens and the earth. And therefore, if God would decree that a certain people group would get a certain geographic location, he alone has the divine right to make that assignment because he is the owner of all the earth. So this brings us to the Abrahamic covenant, and the war between Israel and Iran is in large part a battle over the Abrahamic covenant. And the Bible has various covenants that speak of how God relates to people. There is a debate if there was an Adamic covenant. What there isn't a debate about is there is a Noahic covenant, and then there is an Abrahamic covenant, then there is a Mosaic covenant, and then there is a Davidic covenant, and these lead the way to what Jesus calls the new covenant, which fulfills and supersedes all previous covenants. So the Abrahamic covenant starts, and you can read about this in places like Genesis 15 and Genesis 12. It starts with a man named Abraham. He's elderly. His wife, Sarah, is barren, and he is a pagan. In Nehemiah chapter 9, verse 7, and Acts chapter 7, verses 2 and 3, it says that he came from Ur of the Chaldees. That's also another way of saying ancient Babel, or today what we would call Babylon. So if you were to go to Babylon today in Iraq, it was right around there that Abraham came from and his family. If that sounds familiar, it's because all the way back in Genesis, there were people that came together. They were globalists, not nationalists. The reason that Christians should be nationalists and love their country and be patriotic for their country is because God created nationalism and Satan created globalism. those who are on the progressive left and globalists. They want America to save all the nations and fight all the wars and send all the troops and fund all the expenses. Those are globalists. God's not a globalist. God's a nationalist. God determines the times and places in which we live, Acts 17, so he puts us in the nation of his sovereign choosing. This is why I love the United States of America. I am a patriot. I am very glad to be born into the greatest nation in the history of the world, in my opinion, that has done more for the expansion of the gospel of Jesus Christ than arguably anywhere else on planet Earth. And so this all comes because Babylon was people with a globalist vision. And their vision was, let's all come together, build a great city that has a great tower, and we can go up and be like God. We can literally create heaven on earth. This is also the Marxist vision. The Marxist vision is of a utopian society without God. This explains, by the way, tangentially, why you're seeing an alliance between political progressives who are socialist Marxists and those who are Islamic and possibly even jihadists. Why? Because they both share the demonic spirit of globalism and Babylon. And the Babylonian spirit, though it emerges in the book of Genesis, it continues. Babylon exists again in the days of Daniel, and it's a globalist vision. It continues all the way to the book of Revelation, where Babylon is depicted as a globalist vision of the nations coming together at war against God. And so when you see the same thing happening in different times and places, but there are different people and generations, the point is this: you're seeing new days but old demons. The spirit of Babylon is a globalist, demonic counterfeit spirit that wants to create heaven on earth without God. It's the one thing that the Islamists and the liberal progressive Marxists share in common. I am telling you that the spirit of Babylon could be the demonic reason why these two ideologies that have nothing in common come together in progressive, liberal, democratic policies, because they have the same demonic vision. God, seeing Babylon and Babel, says they're unified with one language and nothing will be too hard for them. It shows that unified unbelievers are more powerful. That unified unbelievers are more powerful than divided believers. So for those of us who are Christian, we need to keep that in mind. What God does to judge them, he scatters them into nations and he confuses their languages. That is God moving human history from nationalism to globalism. Now, back to the story of Abraham and the Abrahamic covenant. Abraham comes from Ur of the Chaldees, Babylon, the place of the demonic spirit of Babylon. His dad is also a pagan. I think it's Joshua 24:2 says that his father worshiped other gods. The word there for gods, it's demons. So here is a guy from a demonic family in an evil place, governed by the spirit of Babylon and a globalistic vision. God shows up to him. You can read this again in Genesis 12 and 15. And God just sovereignly chooses him. And basically says, I'm going to be your God, and I'm going to move you. And you're not going to be a globalist anymore. You're going to be a nationalist. And your nation is going to be in a land of promise, and it'll be the nation of Israel. And I'm making a series of promises to you and your seed. And the seed is very important. The Apostle Paul in the book of Galatians says, quote, that the seed is singular, not plural, not referring to the entire nation of Israel, but particularly to Jesus Christ as the seed or offspring of Abraham and the fulfillment of the Abrahamic covenant and promise to bless the nations of the earth. That from one nation, there would be global blessing to all the nations. That's God's response to globalism. Well, God then tells him, you're going to get a land, a lineage, and a legacy. This leads to the nation of Israel and the land of Israel. So the land of Israel is mentioned in the Old Testament over 2,000 times, plus the New Testament. And Israel as a nation is mentioned, the name Israel, the word Israel, 700 times in the Old Testament, in addition to the New Testament. The Abrahamic covenant, this is a sovereign decree from God. Lineage, land, and Lord. Those are the promises. Lineage is that Abraham's son would be the heir of the covenant promise, and through that son would come a family. Through that family would come a nation. All of this transpires at the end of Genesis, where the nation goes into Egypt, and over 400 years later, the family, I should say, becomes a nation. A family turns into a nation of perhaps 3 million people. That's the fulfillment between the family of Abraham at the end of Genesis and them leaving Egypt over 400 years later as now a nation of a few million people. So there would be a lineage and there would be a land. And God spells out the exact boundaries of the promised land. Therefore, that's exactly what the Jewish people should have through the line of Abraham, because that's what God decreed and declared. And so it would be a lineage, a land, and the Lord. Through the family of Abraham, you can read this, for example, in the opening chapter of Matthew's Gospel. He lists the genealogy of Jesus, and he goes all the way back to Abraham, showing that Jesus Christ is the fulfillment of the Abrahamic covenant promise that through his family would becoming Jesus, who is the blessing to the nations of the earth. So the problem is, Abraham had a barren elderly wife. God said they would have a son. They didn't. So they determined that rather than living by faith, even though Abraham is often mentioned, particularly in places like Hebrews 11, as a man of faith, that they would just take matters into their own hands. And so Sarah, his wife, came up with the horrible idea that he would take basically a maidservant as kind of a second wife, and that he would impregnate her, and that through her they would get a son, and they would sort of adopt and keep that son, and then that son would fulfill the Abrahamic covenant of the lineage, who would then own the land, through whom would come the Lord. So now he takes Hagar and he impregnates her, and she gives birth to a son named Ishmael. Immediately, this creates, as you can anticipate, great conflict within the family, because now you got 2 wives and 1 son. And the wife with the son feels like she's younger and has the heir and the offspring. She's got the upper hand. So now you've got this tension between these 2 wives. This is why polygamy repeatedly in the scriptures just leads to pain, favoritism, generational curses, and devastation. And it's why in my lifetime I expect polygamy to be legalized, because we're all idiots and we don't believe the Bible, and people are horny, and when they get horny, they get stupid. And nonetheless, in the point of Abraham, eventually in his timing, you can't just get God's will, you got to get his timing. Abraham's wife, Sarah, who was the one promised to give birth to the son, she has a son as well. Now you got 2 wives, 2 sons. You've only got 1 covenant. So now the problem is, which son gets to inherit the Abrahamic covenant and all of its blessings, including a nation? Well, this is a big conflict. So what happens then, Sarah has a conflict with Hagar, and ultimately Ishmael is mean to his little brother Isaac. Ishmael, we're told in Genesis, I want to say 16, was a wild donkey of a man. Okay. Today, a lot of the Arabs are descendants of Ishmael, and there are some still wild donkeys of a man. If you've never seen a wild donkey, you don't want to get close, because if they get upset, they're going to kick you, and they are going to pummel you, and they are going to bite you, and they are vicious. It says that Ishmael would be a wild donkey of a man, and he was kind of terrorizing his little brother Isaac. And I'm trying to remember. So one of the proxies that is funded by Iran for global terrorism is Hamas. Hamas is a word that actually does appear in the Bible. I believe it's back in Genesis 6. I did some teaching on this years ago. That in the days of Noah, God looked at the earth, and God was grieved in his heart that he made man, because the earth was filled with Hamas, violence. Hamas is not just a political ideology or a government in perpetuity or just a terrorist organization. It's also a demonic spirit. It's a demonic spirit that manifests itself through those people and organizations and movements and ideologies. And so that word Hamas in Genesis 6 is translated violence. The Hamas spirit it's a jihadist spirit of violent terrorism. It's why God flooded the earth, to get rid of all the people who were possessed by the spirit of Hamas. If memory serves me correct, and I'm pulling a file, I think it's around Genesis 16, where we start to read about the fact that Ishmael was being mean to Isaac. I think it says that he was tormenting or terrorizing him. It's a little bit more Hamas. It's the father of the Arabs terrorizing the father of the Jews. And so what we're seeing today is the geopolitical crisis between Iran and Israel. I'm telling you, it started in the household of Abraham when he impregnated, I believe Hagar was Egyptian, and gave birth to what became largely the Arab peoples. And then through Sarah, God provided the son of the promise, Isaac. So what did Sarah do? She had the slave woman cast out, removed. They could not have a two-wife solution in the same way you cannot have a two-state solution. A two-state solution is just a bigger version of the two-wife problem. One wife has a kid, another wife has a kid. They can't live together. Then they become nations. Well, if two women and two kids can't live together, two nations with two mothers surely cannot live together. This is what is behind the family conflict all the way back to Abraham, some 4,000 years ago, is the backdrop for the war today between Iran and Israel, and now also including the United States of America. Well, to make matters more curious, and I can see this is going to take a while, 2,000 years roughly after Abraham, a man was born named Muhammad. He, around 570 AD, if my memory is correct, said he was visited by an angel. We know it's a demon because of the message it gave. And Paul says, even if we or an angel from heaven should preach a different gospel, let him be accursed. So Muhammad, likely being a descendant of Ishmael, he gets visited by a demon and he invents a new religion called Islam. And within Islam, what he does, he goes back to a lot of the Old Testament, especially the Abrahamic covenant, and he, through demonic clairvoyance, he reinterprets the entire narrative of the scriptures that Isaac is not the son of the promise, that Ishmael is. Furthermore, he starts to reinterpret and retell the story of Genesis and Abraham, so that even when Abraham went to sacrifice Isaac as a prefiguring and a foreshadowing of Jesus Christ, who would carry the wood on his back and lay down his life for his father, he says that that was Ishmael, not Isaac. And so it's a complete deception and a counterfeit from Satan, the father of lies. So through now the line of Ishmael comes a lot of the Arab people, some of whom love Jesus, but many of whom are Muslim, and many of whom think that the Jewish people stole the blessings of the Abrahamic covenant and that the lineage is their family, that the land of Israel belongs to them, and that ultimately their version of the Lord, or this political Messiah that'll rise up in the end, they believe he is the Savior. We know him as the man of lawlessness or the Antichrist. This is what they're aspiring to. So some will say, well, we need to have within Israel a two-state solution, an area for the Jews and an area for those who are non-Jews and largely Arabs. Others would say, well, maybe not a two-state solution, but we need a two-nation solution. So the nation of Israel is here and Iran is here, and can't they just, make big, fences, because good fences make good neighbors? Well, first of all, the two-state solution, it is forbidden by God. This is why Israel not only should destroy the Iranian nuclear capacity to eradicate its citizenry, Israel should also take over the Gaza Strip, and they should remove Hamas as the ruling government in authority. They should treat the Palestinian people with dignity and offer them an opportunity to live as citizens in the nation of Israel. And there are many Muslims as well as Christians in the nation of Israel, because in Deuteronomy 7, here's what God said. God said, so God's people had not yet entered the promised land. It was promised to Abraham, and then Abraham, Isaac, Jacob is the family of Abraham. And then there is a famine that hits, so they relocate nearby to the nation of Egypt in the days of Joseph. There they remain until they are made into slaves and persecuted. Over 400 years later, they have grown from a family of, let's say, around 70 to a nation of, let's say, around 30 million. The lineage is now become fulfilled insofar as the Abrahamic covenant promise is given. God raises up Moses to deliver them. He does deliver them. Because of their grumbling and unbelief, they wander around the wilderness for 40 years, and that entire generation dies in the wilderness, right on the precipice of entering into the promised land, guaranteed in the Abrahamic covenant. You can see God's sovereign hand over all of human history. God not only rules the future, he reveals it in prophecy. So then Joshua was chosen by God to lead the people into the nation of Israel. God spoke through Moses, giving directives for what Joshua and that generation should do upon entering the promised land, thereby fulfilling the promise of the Abrahamic covenant that the lineage would get a land and then ultimately would come the Lord. God says this through Moses in Deuteronomy 7. When the Lord your God brings you into the land you are entering to take possession of it and clears away many nations before you. These are ancient groups: the Hittites, Girgashites, Amorites, Canaanites, Perizzites, Hivites, Jebusites, all the bad guys. 7 nations more numerous and mighty than you. God's going to take down 7 bigger guys, and he's going to take care of you. When the Lord your God gives them over to you and you defeat them, then you must devote them to complete destruction. You shall make no covenant with them and show no mercy to them. You shall not intermarry with them, giving your daughters to their sons or taking their daughters for your sons, for they would turn away your sons from following me to serve other gods. Then the anger of the Lord would be kindled against you, and you would be destroyed quickly. But thus shall you deal with them. You shall break down their altars and dash in pieces their pillars and chop down their Asherim and burn their carved images with fire. God said, when you enter, any of those people that don't leave the promised land, they're all welcome to leave. But any of those people that don't leave the promised land and they want to worship with you and they want to marry with you, you need to eradicate and eliminate them. Some people are just demonic to the core. Some people are possessed by evil spirits, and all you can do with them is just cut off. They need to go away. And if they won't move away, you make them go away. That was God's decree and command. Fast forward, Joshua entered the promised land. Joshua was a good leader, but on this regard, Joshua failed, and he did not fully eradicate those who were present. If you want to know what happens, you can then read the entire book of Judges. The book of Judges talks about everyone did what was evil in his own eyes, and there was this national decline where they were intermarrying and worshiping with all of these people that God said, when you enter the promised land, if they don't leave, you must remove them from the earth. And if you want to see what it looks like to have a 2-state solution, read the book of Judges. I preached through a lot of it. This is Deborah, and this is Gideon, and this is Samson, and this is repeated wars as these enemies keep invading, not honoring the 2-state solution, including the Philistines, who are also part of the descendant of the opposition, possibly even all the way back to Ishmael, because ultimately, just like Hagar and Sarah couldn't live together, God and Satan can't live together, good and evil can't live together, and those who are for God and those who are against God cannot live together. They can't worship together and they can't marry together, because eventually those who are against God overtake those who are for God, or those who were for God are seduced by power and pleasure, oftentimes sexual and political, and they compromise, and you get something called apostasy, which is also the case with mainline liberal Protestant abomination denomination Christianity in America. It's what happens when the church falls into the world and loses all of its saltiness and light. The problem today as well is, so you can't have a two-state solution in Israel, but you also can't have peace between the nation of Israel and Iran. Why? Because the entire ideology of the Iranian government is demonic and spiritual. There's no separation of church and state. I've got some of the notes here, but ultimately, when you're looking at the nation of Iran, you are looking at a nation that is governed by a man who is, I think he's 86 years of age, Khomeini. I think he's ruled for 35 years with an iron fist. He has Islamic army and police state enforcing his moral code. This is a horrible place to be if you are a woman. This is a despicable place to be if you are a Christian. The persecution is severe. And there is a large and growing underground church movement, largely comprised of young Christians in Iran. They love Jesus and they hate the regime that is lording over them. And this is why occasionally you see within Iran attempts to have overthrow of the government and replacing it with something more humane and more sane. But of course, because of the military force, that is constantly put down, and sometimes death is even brought to its own citizens. Khomeini does, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard and a police state. And what we're seeing here as well, this is a man, he's now in hiding. He's seen all of his close military generals and religious leaders executed, including a generation of nuclear scientists. The strategic execution of enemies by Israel is shocking. It's incredibly accurate. And they're not taking out mass civilian casualties. They're targeting terrorists and those who would conspire to terrorize. The reason that you can't have peace between Israel and Iran is because Iran is run as a jihadist state under the rule of the Quran, and the view of the jihadists is globalism. They are also supported by the demonic spirit of Babylon. As I said, Genesis, Daniel, much of the Old Testament, all the way to Revelation continues to talk about Babylon because it's a demonic globalist spirit. And the view of Islam is that they are the right recipients of the Abrahamic covenant through Ishmael, not Isaac, through Hagar, not Sarah, and they are going to take over the world through jihad, holy war, or force that is also supported by the Hamas spirit of violence and terrorism. So, again, Hamas is a group with the Houthis and also Hezbollah that are all working with Iran. And so Iran will fund them and train them and then deploy them as proxies so that as they do war and terror, Iran can say that was them, that's not us. But the truth is, if Iran is the head, then Hezbollah, Houthis, and Hamas are the hands, and they're doing the work. But the Hamas charter says this: Israel will exist and will continue to exist until Islam will obliterate it. The Islamic resistance movement is a distinguished Palestinian movement whose allegiance is to Allah, which is the name of a powerful demonic false god, and whose way of life is Islam. It strives to raise the banner of Allah over every inch of Palestine, the Promised Land. The Prophet, Allah bless him and grant him salvation, has said, quote, "The day of judgment will not come about until Muslims fight the Jews, killing the Jews. Allah is its target, the Prophet is its model, the Quran its constitution, jihad is its path, and death for the sake of Allah is the loftiest of wishes." Okay. This is the heart of Islamic jihadism. These are people who think that dying as a martyr is the highest honor. Imagine if these people get nuclear weapons. If you're in the United States of America and you're a pacifist, you need to know that's not how the rest of the world works. The rest of the world is not governed by the pacifists. The rest of the world is governed by pass the fist. It's about violence. It's about war. It's about the strong controlling the weak. And it's about those in power devastating and destroying those who are under their rule. If you are some sort of limp-wristed, weak-kneed, soft-headed progressive that got some degree, in ethnomusicology from a community college by some guy with long hair whose name was, I don't know, Ferry, then you may not understand how the rest of the world works. And you may not understand that people who are willing to kill you and themselves for their God, they're demonic and evil. You can't negotiate with them. You have to eradicate them. That's what needs to happen, especially if they want to have nuclear weapons. What you would get would be the equivalent of a suicide bomber. A suicide bomber has one bomb and they blow themselves up and others up. Now give that same ideology a nuclear weapon, and what you will get is a suicide bomber that seeks to eradicate all life on the earth so that the globe is now governed by those who remain and are jihadists. Goes on to say, the Islamic resistance movement believes that the land of Palestine is consecrated for future Muslim generations until Judgment Day. Notice the counterfeiting of the biblical storyline. Nationalism, from the point of view of the Islamic resistance movement, is part of the religious creed. Killing Jews and taking the land, that is your religious duty. Christians, we read the Bible and pray. The jihadists, they kill Jews and take land. Those are their sacraments like baptism and communion. That's what they do. Nothing in nationalism is more significant or deeper than in the case when an enemy should tread Muslim land. Resisting and quelling the enemy becomes the individual duty of every Muslim, male or female. There is no solution for the Palestinian question except through jihad. This is the Hamas Charter. This is their most important ideological document. This is the mentality and ideology that also runs those in Iran and those other bad actor Muslim jihadist nations. They would say all of Israel is actually Palestine. It's Muslim land stolen by the Jews with the assistance of the United States of America, and they have a right in the sight of God to vindicate their mother and their father, Hagar and Ishmael. They need to right this historic wrong. They need to take back that land because it belongs to their family, and that ultimately their ideology and the devotion to their God will lead to global domination, and Islam and the Quran and the jihadists will rule the world, and they will once and for all fulfill the Abrahamic promise by themselves controlling and domineering planet Earth for their demon god. Another senior Hamas official, Mohammed al-Zahar, says, the entire planet will be under our law. There will be no more Jews or Christian traitors. We believe in what our prophet Muhammad said. Allah drew the ends of the world near one another for my sake, and I have seen its eastern and western ends. The dominion of my nation would reach those ends that have been drawn near me. The entire 510 million square kilometers of planet Earth will come under a system where there is no injustice, no oppression, no Zionism. That's no Jews or Christians, no treacherous Christianity, and no killings and crimes like those being committed against the Palestinians and against the Arabs in all the Arab countries in Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, and other countries. Well, there's my 46-minute answer to the first question. How does the war in Iran relate to end times biblical prophecy? Completely and totally. This is a family feud that goes back 4,000 nations, 4,000 years, And though it goes from nation to nation and generation to generation, it is ultimately a spiritual warfare over the rightful recipient of the Abrahamic covenant.